Wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love.
Paragraphs denoted in your Bible. Some modern Bibles do that. There might be a paragraph break at verse 24. I lumped all this together all the way through verse 28. So we're dealing now with boils on the skin, as opposed to raw things as were described in the earlier diseases. When the body has a boil on its skin and it is healed, and in the place of the boil, there's a white swelling or a reddish white bright spot, then it shall be shown to the priest. And the priest shall look and behold, if it appears to be lower than the skin, and by the way, I think lower than the skin means deeper than the surface. Lower than the skin, and the hair on it is turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is the infection of leprosy. It has broken out in the boil. But if the priest looks at it, and behold, there is no white hairs in it, and it's not lower than the skin, and is faded, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 days. And if it spreads further on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infection. But if the bright spot remains in its place, does not spread, it is only the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or if the body sustains on its skin a burn by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white, then the priest shall look at it. This is all very similar to this other process, in the same determinations in those things. So we won't read all that again. But if a boil or a burn heals, but then leaves a swelling behind that has a certain coloration and that affects the hair growth within it. And by the way, when it says if the hair at the spot is white, it kind of precludes that we're not dealing with an older person whose all of their hair has gone white. This is a unique situation connected to the wound. Then that person's unclean. If you can't tell, the same process as before. You wait 7 days, you put them in isolation, you wait 7 days, you examine them again. If it hasn't spread, if it's not gotten any worse, if it hasn't changed in any way, it's just what's left from the previous issue. There was a boil there was a burn there's a scar. Don't worry about it. Let them go back about their life and their business. However, if it's gotten worse, or there's a clear spreading of there's something more serious there, that person's unclean, and you treat them as one who is unclean. So all of these things tend to lend themselves to consequences behind damage to the skin, which again, the text never says this because this is not medical. And we talked about that last week. This is not at all about medicine. This is not about healing people. This is not about even protecting the camp necessarily from some wild disease. It's for teaching purposes, largely. We got them going to priests, not to doctors. We got them determining that they're clean or unclean, not healthy or diseased. We have them doing nothing to address the uncleanness, but expelling them from the camp, and yet recognizing that it might yet become clean. By the way, was there anything said about how I could act in order to make this disease become clean? No. And so it's not even about that. It's simply about the process of recognizing what is clean and what is unclean, and whether or not you can follow the objective structure that God put in place and honor that structure or not. The next section, starting at verse 29 and reading through verse 37, is dealing with the disease of the head or the beard. Again, very similar. You got this disease that appears on the head or the beard. It's examined. If there's, and this is interesting, instead of a white hair this time, we're concerned with if a yellow hair appears. That indicates uncleanness. That's verse 30. Priest shall look at the infection. If it appears to be deeper than the skin and there's a thin yellowish hair in it. If they're uncertain, again, the same process, isolation, re-examination occurs. That's verses 31 through 33. If healed, the person is clean. What else does he deal with in this section? Look at verse 40. If a man loses the hair of his head, uh-oh, Leo, are we clean or unclean? Well, I don't know about that. I think you shaved it off because, David, me, by the way, does it matter the pattern of the baldness? Well, let's see what he says. If a man loses his hair, loses the hair of his head and is bald, he's clean. Go me. And if his head becomes bald at the front and the sides, that's not as much me. He's bald on his forehead, he's clean. But if the bald is near bald head or the bald forehead, so you can lose your hair in the back, which is primarily where I've lost most of mine, on the crown of your head, or you can lose your hair on the front, what we call male pattern baldness, and doesn't matter, you're clean. That's just a normal occurrence. Apparently, it happened to the Israelites as well as us Europeans, and no harm, no foul. But, and there's that word, if, and this is verse 42, on the bald head or the bald forehead, there occurs a reddish white infection. It is leprosy breaking out on his bald head. Then the priest shall look at him. If the swelling of the infection is reddish white on his bald head or his bald forehead, like the appearance of leprosy in the skin of the body, he is a leprous man. He is unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His infection is on his head. Now I'm going to stop here for a minute. What's the big difference? And why do we have a separate category here? Well, there's two reasons. First off, some baldness is completely natural, has nothing to do with the designation of clean and unclean. He wants to make that clear. The second thing is, if this breaks out on your forehead or the head, the part of your head that is bald, guess what? It doesn't have hair. One of the determinations about a lesion, whether it was leprous or not, was the color of the hair that resided within it. But now we got a person that has no hair where this lesion breaks out. How do I know whether that's leprous or not? Well, he defines that. It has to be a certain color, reddish white. It has to have the appearance otherwise of lesions in other places that would be considered leprous. And then he's unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His infection is on his head. As for the leper who has the infection in his clothes, his clothes shall be torn. And verse 45 to the end gets into some important discussion as far as what someone who is deemed leprous is supposed to do. The leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn. Okay, what's that about? Okay, a sign, that's what they did when they were in grief and in mourning. They tore their clothes. So this is an indication. But I'll also add, if you're walking around in torn clothes, that's also a sign. People can see that. People may not see a leprous lesion on your arm that's covered by your clothes. And so there's going to be some obligations that they have to make people aware. So you got to tear your clothes. It says, the hair of his head shall be uncovered. He shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. So you don't wear a hat. You don't actually, some translations will say it's to be loose. Most people believe that it's saying that you're not supposed to groom your hair, which again makes you look kind of ratty and obvious. You are to cover your face, and you are to announce to people that you're unclean. He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. All right, so again, at this point in time, it's called a camp. Why? Because they're still traveling in the wilderness. They're living in tents. They have a very strict way in which they set up their encampments, where the temple is in the center and the tribes are stationed around the sides facing in particular directions. And if you had leprosy, now notice it does not say that they are abandoned. It simply says that they have to dwell outside the camp. They don't get to live with everyone else. They have to separate themselves from everyone else. The fact that they have to dress a certain way and announce to people that they're unclean indicates to me that they're not so far removed from the camp that no one's ever going to run into them. There are other reasons people had to leave camp. And so they're just outside the borders. When this gets applied later on, once they've gone into the promised land, they still have these same restrictions. Where would the leprous person live? Outside the city, away from other people. He shall live alone. They were not put into leper colonies. Europeans did that. They were alone. Dwelling shall be outside the camp. When a garment has a mark of leprosy in it, whether it's a one. Now this gets really interesting. How does a garment have leprosy? Okay, but the text says nothing about bacteria, though I would agree that this is probably dealing with microscopic things like bacteria and mold and various other things. The various things that cause rot. Right. And that is somebody's opinion about what this is talking about. Right. There is and that becomes important, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So we've got a garment now. We need to understand now we're moving away from people. We're now dealing with objects, possessions. And these are not garments that have been deemed unclean because a leper has touched them. This is something that in and of itself is deemed to be leprous. Whether it's a wool garment or a linen garment. Verse 48, I found very interesting. I spent a lot of time talking, studying and looking up and seeing what people said about this because it was baffling to me. Whether in warp or woof. All right, what is warp and woof? Okay. Warp is I think the vertical pieces that go lengthwise through the entire garment, and woof is the horizontal pieces that give tapestry design, that create color patterns, that one is structural, one is design based. They are all woven all throughout and intertwined. How could it affect warp and not woof, or woof and not warp? But it's careful to say this, whether it is woof or warp. Or actually, I get that, guys. It says it the other way around, but it does not say and. It says or, saying it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's the. So what that would indicate to me is whatever this is, it can travel down strands and isn't necessarily going to spread to things that touch it across, but will spread through the garment one direction. That's the point. It doesn't matter where in the garment it is. Well, that's entirely possible. If we are talking about fungal or bacterial or mold kind of infestation, then that's certainly something that could be in the wool that's then woven into threads, then put in place, that stays dormant for a long time, but gets moisture in some way, and boom, it starts to grow. And now you got this garment that has this spot. And this is what you need to be looking for, he says. And it doesn't matter if it's wool, it doesn't matter if it's linen, it doesn't matter if it's leather. It doesn't matter where on the garment or what part of the garment it is. If the mark is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather or in the warp or in the woof or in any article of leather in its leprous mark, it shall be shown to the priest. And so if it's purple, maybe you deem that as reddish. If it's orange, maybe you deem that as reddish. If it's yellow, it's not greenish or reddish, it's a completely different color. If it's blue, I don't guess it matters. What's really being told here is we're not dealing with just a discoloration, a bleached out area, a spot where ink has been spilled, a discoloration, a stain. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something quite different, and that becomes even more clear. So he tells specifically we're looking for greenish or reddish. And then he says, the priest shall look at the mark and shall quarantine the article with the mark for 7 days. He shall then look at the mark on the 7th day. If the mark has spread in the garment, whether in the warp or in the woof or in the leather, whatever the purpose for which the leather is used, if the mark is a leprous malignancy, it is unclean. So here's the test. Okay, you notice, hey, there's this greenish spot here. Wasn't there last week, it's there this week. I need to bring this to the priest. Priest looks at it and says, all right, we're going to set it off over here. We're going to quarantine it for a week. I'm going to look at it in a week. If it has spread, it's unclean. If it hadn't spread, it's just a discoloration. No big deal. So he shall burn the garment. Glad I wasn't a garment if I was deemed unclean. He shall burn the garment, whether the warp or the woof, in wool or in linen or in any article of leather in which the mark occurs, for it is a leprous malignancy, it shall be burned in the fire. But if the priest shall look, and indeed the mark has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or the woof, or in any article of leather, then the priest shall order them to wash the thing in which the mark occurs. He shall quarantine it for 7 more days. Okay, so it hadn't spread. All right, wash it. Now notice it does not say that the priest washes it. It says the priest orders them to wash it. and then is quarantined for 7 more days. After the article with the mark has been washed, the priest shall again look, and if the mark has not changed its appearance, even though the mark has not spread, it is unclean. In other words, if washing doesn't get it out, it's unclean. You shall burn it in the fire, whether an eating away has produced bareness on the top or the front of it. So it doesn't matter whether it affects the top, the front, whether it affects the back. If it's starting to deteriorate the garment, if it's starting to rot the fabric away, if washing doesn't rectify the problem and instead it gets worse, it starts eating away at the garment's burned. The priest shall look. If the mark has faded after it's been washed, then he shall tear it out of the garment or out of the leather, whether from the warp or from the woof. If it appears again in the garment, whether the warp or the woof, or any article of leather, it is an outbreak. The article which the mark shall be burned with fire. So again, they remove the section that was affected. If other parts of the garment start having problems after that, the garment's burned. It's talking about, and if you look at this through this whole thread, what he's saying is if it's something that goes away, if it's something that can be washed and cleaned, no problem. If it's something that spreads or that continues, problem. If it continues to persist, if it spreads to other areas of the garment, if it starts deteriorating the fabric, that's an issue. And the garment is to be deemed unclean and is to be burned. Doesn't matter what part of the garment, it has to go. This is the law for the mark of leprosy in a garment of wool or linen, whether in the warp or in the woof or in any article of leather, for pronouncing it clean or unclean. When it says any article of leather, understand that if it's a leather apron, if it's shoes, if it's whatever, a leather shield, a purse, satchel, okay, it doesn't matter. So we've got this disease in garments. Now, again, I don't think this has anything to do with, hey, this might spread and affect you if you're wearing it. You're going to get sick. Or if you touch somebody because you're wearing it, you're going to get them sick. It's, again, simply just making an objective determination of that which is clean and that which is unclean. And what do you do with things that are unclean? You get rid of them. Ultimately, what happens to a person who is unclean? Ultimately is the important word I'm using there. How? They're cast into the fire and burned. I think that is why these articles are to be burned. He doesn't want to teach that on people, so he uses these articles to teach that lesson. Yes, they do. If they're useful, if they can be cleaned, then they can be kept and used. If they cannot be cleaned, then they are to be discarded and thrown into the fire. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we want to talk for a moment in the time we have left. Yeah, I got several things, but primarily we want to talk for a moment about the purpose of these examination laws, because that's really what this chapter is about. This chapter is instructing the priest what he's supposed to be looking for. I pointed out earlier, I'll point it out again, priests, not healers, are to examine and declare clean or unclean. Scripture speaks of physicians. Genesis 50 in verse 2. With Joseph, there's already an awareness of physicians. There were already people who specialized in the art of healing. It's not like priests are used because there was no concept of physician. By the way, where had they been living? Egypt. If 400 years before, when Joseph was in Egypt, Egypt had physicians, 400 years later, when they're released from Egypt, Egypt had physicians. These people's entire existence was in a society where physicians existed. He does not say, call a healer, call a physician. Did they have physicians among themselves? Well, at least by New Testament time they did, for sure. Because Luke was such a physician. So I think it's significant that he's asking for priests to make these determinations. Because it's not about the disease as much as it's about declaring that which is clean from that which is unclean. Yes.
It reminds me of the sheep that Peter seen. And I believe this has something to do with it when he talked about the dietary law and how those things was unclean. When Peter seen the vision, and then God said, eat, he said, I have never eaten anything unclean. He said, who are you to call what I clean unclean? Talking about the Gentiles.
Correct.
Now, when you hear that and you read this, nothing to do with a physician or a doctor. And Jesus is the high priest, is the only one who can clean us and determine whether we cleaned or not, like the priest did. It was just a, what they call that, not a metaphor, but another type.
Yep.
Another type of Christ, because everything in the old we learned about the law was pertaining to him. And I see this as Christ being our high priest, and he's the one who can make those that are unclean clean, the same way the priest can determine based off of certain things.
Unclean, yeah. I'll even go back to talk about the food thing again. We need to remember, after the flood, God gave them all animals to eat. He said that they were all good for food. What made those animals unclean? God declared them unclean. And the point that's being made to Peter is exactly the point that you brought up and that this text is teaching. What God declares as clean, we are not to call unclean. What God declares as unclean, we are not to call clean. It is the same thing with calling evil good and good evil. When God determines that something is evil, I don't look at it and say, ain't nothing wrong with that. Well, I shouldn't. I can't say that I never have. And I hear it in the world all the time. Nobody's hurt by that. Why does that matter? I don't see anything wrong with it. How do I see something wrong? Becomes the question. And he is teaching them how to see what is wrong from what is right. And how do I do that? By his instructions. And he defines here what is wrong. And therefore, anything not fitting that description is what? It's clean. So you might have a skin eruption of some sort. But if it doesn't meet the qualifications that are described here, it doesn't make you unclean. By the way, I'll even throw this out there for fun. Some of those may even be worse maladies than what's described here. And I say may because it's only a possibility. But my point being is that what makes it unclean is that God has defined it as such. And that is exactly what the Lord's point to Peter is in that vision, is do not call what I have called clean, unclean. The minute he told Peter, rise, kill, and eat, meant that he was defining the things on that sheet as being what? Clean for food. And Peter says, I can't do that. I don't eat unclean things. And God says, you don't define what's clean and unclean. I define what's clean and unclean. And so that is certainly part of the purpose here, because what we're doing is not making subjective judgments. I think I used this illustration last week or 2 weeks ago with my wife in one of her medical conditions that has a temporary diagnosis at this point, because the doctors are not comfortable diagnosing this thing, and they know it's worse than that thing, and so they've picked the thing that they're most comfortable saying it is, but they're not really sure. That's what goes on in medicine all the time. And the process, when they made it scientific in medicine, is called a differential. And you put all the symptoms up there and all the variables that are involved, and you look at the ones and you rank them and order them and go, okay, there is a 70% chance that somebody that presents this way has this malady, and a 64% chance that it's this, and a 40% chance that it's this. And then they go down, they start treating you from the one that is most likely to be. And that is all subjective judgment. Now, it's informed subjective judgment, but it's still subjective judgment, because I don't know if you've ever tried to do any of that stuff. I have. You get this description, and then you look at a picture and you're like, well, that doesn't look like what's described there. And they go, yeah, but that's what it is. And I'm like, but it looks at that like, yeah, that doesn't matter. There's a lot of it that's just, you just learn. And you go, yeah, that's what that is, even though it doesn't look exactly like that in every case. And that's the problem. A particular issue doesn't present with exactly the same visual effect every single time. So there's a lot of that's subjective judgment on their part. And that's why some people are good doctors and some people are fair doctors. All doctors are probably better at it than any one of us, because we don't have the education or the tools and the skills to do what they do currently. We'd go to school and learn them and develop the ability. But it's subjective. This is not. It's not left up to the priest to decide whether this is a problem or not. It's specifically told, if it does this and this and this, then it's a problem. And that becomes very important for us as well, and when we determine what sin is, either for ourselves or for other people. I don't get to say, well, I just feel like that's wrong. That just seems wrong to me. The question is it clearly defined in Scripture as wrong? And if I don't know, then I better hold my judgment until I can know. That to me is what this lesson is. If you can't look at it and say, this is leprous, then you wait until you get enough information to say one way or the other. You don't make the determination on a guess or on a hunch, or I just feel like. Because very often those I just feel like it's wrong happens mainly because of what? Because I don't like you. I feel like it's wrong when it's you, but if it's somebody that I do like, I may judge the same thing as not being a problem at all. And that's the problem with subjective judgments in these things. And we're being told, being taught, that is not how it works. God defines what's unclean. God defines how it's determined. All we do is learn what God has said and then apply what God has said to the circumstances. The decisive issue throughout all this is whether the thing spreads or whether it goes away. If it goes away and is rectified, it is not a problem. If it spreads, that's a problem. Uncleanness requires separate. By the way, that spreading is from within the person, the individual, or the group. Within the garment are other things that may come into contact with it. Uncleanness requires separation from the camp always. And that is about protecting the place where God dwells. Because God chose to dwell within the camp of Israel. God put his name there. And so where God is, there can be no uncleanness. What does God desire to happen? For that which is unclean and outside the camp to do what? To be cleansed and be reincorporated into the camp. And that's what chapter 14 is going to be about, is how to make that happen. So we're about out of time. We probably are out of time. And I will leave what little bit I have left here, which is just some summary kind of stuff, to the introduction next class period. And that is a week from next week, because next week will be the first Wednesday of the month. But we'll look at that then and get into chapter 14, which is the fun chapter, because that's all about reintegrating these things that have been separated into the camp. And that's what God is always seeking to do, is to cleanse and bring in. And so he's teaching that. From day one, he's teaching them about bringing the unclean inside and the process in which that's possible. Because that's, in fact, what he's teaching in this whole book about them. How are they going to have fellowship with God? Through their atonement and through that process of being cleansed. And so that's where we're going with this. Appreciate everybody's comments and participation this evening.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love.